Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time center of pestilence, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss magic, mysticism, religion, the occult, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, we're going to be exploring Thelema a little bit deeper. If you've been around here for a while, I'm a Thelamite occultist. That's the core of my practice. That's the core of what I do. And Thelema is something that I like to talk about here. But I wanted to talk about Thelema in an aspect that people aren't really aware of, and that would be the Thalimic connection to witchcraft. Many people think of witchcraft and Thelema as kind of not in the same camp, right? People like to make this dichotomy of ceremonial versus folk magic. And because they form that dichotomy, they think they cannot overlap, because the majority of magic that is associated with Thelema and that comes out of Thelema is what we would call ceremonial. But what if I told you this dichotomy might not be as true as you'd think, and that Thelema is actually in the core of most modern Western forms of witchcraft? Because if you did not know this, Thelema was a revolutionary paradigm, and after Crowley, the community looked radically different. And even people who claim they hate Crowley, they hate Thelema, you can still typically see traces of Thelema in their practice and in what they do. So in this video, we're going to be exploring that connection in a bit of depth and with some nuance. So let's break into it. First of all, let's do definitions. We're gonna do them really, really quickly because if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you know them, so we're just gonna go rapid fire pace. Thelema. Thelema is a religion, mysticism system, and philosophy that comes out of Aleister Crowley that is a specific Western system and has a connection to ideas like true will, there are various ritual practices associated with it, etc., etc., etc. Then witchcraft. I'm going to use a pretty purist definition of witchcraft because the word witchcraft gets used on a lot of things that I don't personally think are witchcraft. For instance, I've seen a lot of people call things like hoodoo or folk Catholicism or Santeria witchcraft. I reject that because people of those traditions, first of all, are offended when you call them a witch, so I don't think we should impose that on them. And second of all, they have a different core to them and a different sort of history and background. So we're going to use the purest definition that witchcraft is a European style of folk magic that revolves around themes of transgression, liminality, betweenness. That's the definition we're using. And now let's talk about how they connect. So let's take a historic perspective, and we're going to talk about the most common form of witchcraft that people are familiar with. That would be Wicca. Wicca is ubiquitous. When people get into the occult, Wicca is oftentimes sort of the great gateway drug, right? Like, I'm sure a lot of people watching this video, you know, you wanted to get all spiritual, and you started meditating, and then you picked up a book by Scott Cunningham, and then you're like, I want to go a little deeper, and then eventually you found sort of the stuff that I discuss. That could even be how you found my channel. I could be in the recommendations of a Wiccan YouTuber's videos, right? But Wicca actually comes from Thelema in a lot of ways. Not entirely. I think when people call Wicca like earthy Thelema, that's not really true, and I don't really like that, but there is a connection. So Gerald Gardner was the person who sort of started Wicca. Gerald Gardner was a member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO. For those who are unfamiliar, the OTO is a Thalimic organization. The OTO was not originally a Thalimic organization. It was originally a clandestine German Masonic group that got kind of kicked out of Masonry, and then Crowley took it over and made it a Thalimic group, but Gerald Gardner was a student there. Then Gerald Gardner sort of went on his own, and he met these women known as the New Forest Coven. Some people dispute this, but we're not going to get into that here. This is not the video for that. I know there's an entire book on this subject. I think it was Ronald Hutton who wrote it, who is an amazing historian. Love his work. Everyone in the community stems for him a little bit. So read that if you want to know, like, you know, the debates on this or whatever. But anyways, the story goes where Gerald Gardner went out into the woods, he was English, and met these women who were this like sky-clad coven of witches, and they were an unbroken witch lineage dating way, way back, and they taught him their magic, and that became Wicca. So what Wicca became is what they taught them syncretized with the Western ceremonial traditions that led into Thelema and are Thelema, making Wicca a distinct system. Wicca is very interesting because Wicca is fundamentally a fertility religion based around the god and the goddess. There's an earth-based feeling to it, and it really was the first tradition to reclaim the word witch. As for the longest time, witch was kind of used in a very negative way, right? Like, people in the 1600s who did magic, because they did exist, they didn't call themselves witches. If you called them a witch, they'd probably lose their shit on you. There's actually folk magic things to prevent witchcraft. But Wicca took this and changed it. And then as Wicca grew and evolved, especially as the 1990s came and writers like Scott Cunningham arose and people became solitary Wiccans, it changed even more to the point where you can't see as much Thelema in it now than you can in the original stuff. Interestingly though, there is a form of Wicca because there are subtypes of Wicca. There's not like one Wicca. Like if you talk to a Gardnerian Wicca versus a, you know, solitary eclectic Wicca, they're going to be talking about very different things to the point where they're almost two separate traditions. They kind of did like a spiritual balkanization. Can I call it a spiritual balkanization? I don't know if I can do that. But basically, you know, Wicca has become a bunch of different things that are very different. But one of these sort of more purist, original, traditional Wiccan sects, Alexandrian Wicca, is really interesting because they have ideas such as Enochian and Solomonic magic mixed into their witchcraft, which to some people who are new may be like, what? That doesn't make any sense. How can you mix them? Alexandrian Wicca says, yes, we can, and we do. And interestingly, this idea of the god and the goddess does relate to the Thalimic notion of the unification of opposites. When you look at the sort of cosmology and theology behind Thelema, which is very Kabbalistic, you notice this idea of mercy, severity, masculine, feminine, malefic, benefic, this force, this form, and them coming together creates that unification and that mixed space, which is the child, the perfected form. That is what so many Thalimic magical formulas are based off of, and Wicca carries it. The way that the athame and chalice are used in Wicca are very similar to how a lot of these concepts are used in Thalimic magic. And so you can see that core there. As well, an interesting thing is in Thelema we say, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, love is the law, love under will. And then Dorian Valiente, a prominent Wiccan thinker, ended up writing what is known as the Wiccan Raid, which, you know, it's a controversial thing, but we're just not going to get into the discourse around it. I've covered it on my podcast. Some people don't like the Raid, they think it's outdated. Some people think the Raid, you know, lacks nuance, etc., etc. As well, not all Wiccans actually adhere to the Raid. That is a misconception. But an interesting thing at the end of the Raid is, and harm ye none, do what ye will. And you can notice that do what thou will, do what ye will. There's a clear and visible parallel there. As well, some of the ritual things that people do, they parallel pretty strongly, right? Like you can see a bit of a parallel. This is maybe some people think this is a bit of a reach, but I see it pretty strongly between, say, doing a star sapphire, which is sort of an elemental thing, versus doing, say, calling of the corners. So there's a lot in there that people wouldn't necessarily connect, but are there. As well, there are many modern Thelemites who are both what they would call traditional Wiccans and Thelemites. There's an overlap community-wise, and I think that's really cool. There's no reason why you can't do both, because they do sort of come from the same tree, right? They come down the same tree, they're from the same theological evolution, and so they actually coexist very cleanly and nicely. The next thing I want to talk about is the witchcraft. So this term may sound a little unfamiliar, but hear me out. So there's a Thelamite who I actually have a video on named Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a Thelamite in the 1940s in California. He was an American Thelamite, and there's a lot of really interesting things about his life. He developed the rocket fuel and jet fuel that was used to get the people to the moon. He was a revolutionary astrophysicist, but he was also an occultist, and he was a very brilliant Thelamite occultist, in my opinion. Crowley actually was not as huge of a fan of him, but his work, in my opinion, was pretty brilliant. And he, as he, got older, he started experimenting more. He was very into Thelema, but he took it in a slightly different way, as he was devoted to Babylon. Babylon comes up quite a bit in original Thelema, or classical Thelema, traditional Thelema, whatever you want to call it, especially in the Vision and the Voice. The Vision and the Voice is a sort of record or diary of Crowley's surfing of the Enochian Aethers, which for context, Enochian is an angelic form of magic, and they have these things called the Aethers, and when you experience them, a lot of really interesting things happen, and Crowley noted an entity named Babylon. Babylon is very interesting theologically, because Babylon sort of dates back to a lot of very, very early stuff into the Canaanites. You can see a lot of parallels between her and Inanna Ishtar, a powerful goddess. And also we've got some revelations in there, right? Like we see Babylon, spelled differently though with a Y, being described in Revelations in a very interesting way. He was really devoted to Babylon, and he really wrote in the divine feminine into Thelema in a different way, right? Crowley sort of saw women in an interesting way as like a way for male magicians to sort of move forward, right? Women were sort of the gatekeepers to certain mysteries, but Jack Parsons sort of flipped that and really devoted himself to Babylon in a very self-sacrificing way, which is a very different way than how Crowley kind of related to the divine feminine. So very interesting stuff there. But later in his life, he sort of had this idea called the witchcraft. which is sort of explored in his piece Liber 49, which he actually argued was the 4th chapter of the Book of the Law. A lot of Thelemites will dispute that and take big issue with that claim, but he did claim it. And he actually posed another duotheism, much like how Gerald Gardner posed the god and the goddess, which Gerald Gardner used the triple goddess, the moon goddess, and the horned god, or however, there are various names people use, different covens use different names. But Jack Parsons, who didn't interact with Gardner to my knowledge, actually posed Horus and Babylon as the god and the goddess, which actually I feel like correlates very closely with the Thelemic mysteries and the deities that pop up again and again in Thelema. And his witchcraft was very sort of transgressive. It was darker. It was much darker than Wicca, in my opinion. Though I don't like the idea that Wicca is super light and fluffy. I think that's a misconception, but his witchcraft was very, raw and feral. He, in a way, was described as messy by a lot of Thelemites because he sort of rejected the order and the strictness of a lot of Thelemic magic in favor of a more raw and visceral type. And so his idea of the witchcraft sort of grew from that. Sadly, Jack Parsons, a lot of his records and stuff that he wrote were destroyed, and he died sadly terribly young, but he sort of explored that. And his Scarlet Woman, Marjorie Cameron, did these sort of art pieces about witchcraft that were really cool, and her work sort of connects to what I think Parsons was getting to with the witchcraft. There's another connection, and this is one that people really don't discuss, and that would be the cultist Sabbaty. So the cultist Sabbaty is a traditional witchcraft organization that you could call sabbatic witchcraft. It was started by Andrew Chumbley, and now it is run by Schulke, who is a writer on sort of plant magic and sabbatic witchcraft. And this group is very fascinating because what they do is they really put that transgression back into witchcraft, and their work, though it is sort of hard to get copies of, some of it's easier to get than others, there's this deeply initiatic feeling to it. There's this liminality. There's this emphasis through Chumbley really put emphasis on dreams and the subconscious and, going to the witch's sabbat through that liminal astral projectee type way. And then with Schulke, there's this emphasis on plants and sort of plant spirits and the 13 pathways of occult herbalism and what, working with a plant truly means. But throughout this, there's this return to this sort of European notion of what the Sabbat was, right? Because we understand that in European art and in pieces like the Malleus Maleficarium, which was used as a manual to sort of witch hunt, there's this notion that women would sort of slip out of their bodies and go to the witch's sabbat and engage in all sorts of debauchery, and cultist Sabbaty sort of, explores that in an interesting way, saying that there's things like dream initiation into it, that maybe it wasn't necessarily a literal thing, but it was sort of a spiritual thing, and that connects to Thelema in an interesting way as well, because one of the people that really influenced Andrew Chumbley was Kenneth Grant. Kenneth Grant is a Thelemic writer who created the system known as Typhonian Thelema. Typhonian Thelema I've never really covered in much depth because it's not my personal cup of tea. It's not really where I go, but the Typhonian tradition is, I would say, more antinomian than mainstream Thelema is, which mainstream Thelema comes across pretty antinomian to most people, but Typhonian Thelema takes it a little bit further. There's almost like a Lovecraftian feel to Typhonian Thelema to me, like it has a very Cthulhu vibe, but it is much darker, and it sort of turns certain Thelemic ideas onto its head. It's much less solar. And as well, there are certain ideas that are explored into it that I would say are influential on the modern left-hand path, like the Qliphoth, which is sort of the night side of Kabbalah. I don't like the idea that the Qliphoth is like the inverse tree, because I don't think that's really true. I think the Qliphoth is best understood as like the husk around the corn that is Kabbalah, like, because Qlipha means husk, Spira means spear, so it's like the cusp, like the husk around the corn. A lot of these modern Qliphothic ideas are really brought into what they are by Grant. It does date back to Pardes Rimanin, which is an older Jewish text, but Pardes Rimanin, it's very hard to get copies of, and it's very hard to read, and it's very complex. And there are like bits of the Qliphoth throughout older Jewish Kabbalah, but modern, like when the left-hand path talks about Qliphoth, like they're really pulling from Kenneth Grant. And so Kenneth Grant's system is very fascinating. It's very different. Reading Grant is a bit of a challenge, but thankfully, recently, the publisher that publishes Grant's books has been like re-releasing them as mass market paperbacks, which is amazing because his books used to be very hard to get. They're now much more available, but they're still very, very interesting. And he was close with Chumbley. Another person he was close to was Austin Osmond Spare, who I call the sort of proto-chaos magician, because through his work, the idea of chaos stuff emerged. He was working before that term had dropped. Can I call it dropped? I feel like I'm talking about like an album when I say that. Can I say occult paradigms dropped? I feel like that's kind of weird. Like, new religion just dropped. Anyways, back onto the topic. His breakaway was what became that. And what he broke away with was so Crowley loved Spare. Spare did not really like Crowley. Spare kind of thought Crowley was a bit pompous, and there was too much pomp and circumstance in Thalimic magic. And so Spare sort of stripped it down, and he came up with these ideas like the alphabet of desire, the atavistic resurgence. There's a lot of ideas that come out of Spare that are very interesting, but Spare, Grant, and Chumbley all sort of influenced each other, and to fully understand each of those, you need to understand the other ones. So this sabbatic tradition, which the sabbatic witchcraft tradition is the basis of what people call tradcraft or traditional witchcraft in a lot of ways, though there are sort of other origins to that. The thing is, people say traditional witchcraft, very interesting, because it's not really necessarily that it's older, it's that it is like tradition in the primal tradition sense. Like when they talk about tradition, they mean like the witch's Sabbath, not necessarily like older. It's like a sort of mystical tradition. We call it like capital T tradition versus lowercase t tradition. Like lowercase t tradition would be old thing, capital tradition would be like the notion of a mystic tradition and a lower truth underneath all of it. That's how I'm going to define it. Isn't necessarily older. A lot of modern like traditional witchcraft ideas do come from out of Chumbley, and a lot of it's from like people like Paul Hewson, who were writing in the 70s. So when people say they practice tradcraft and talk about like, you know, the man in black, the witch's Sabbath, a lot of this stuff is from newer sources, some even younger than Wicca, but it is a fundamentally different thing. And you still see this Crowleyan Thalimic influence on it because you see this Typhonian influence. And so Thelema once again becomes inescapable. It's everywhere. It's seeping through in subtle ways. And so in a sense, I do believe all occultists should read Crowley, even if you don't like Crowley, even if you think he's an asshole, you think he's bad, whatever you think about him, he is so influential that I think you should sit down and read him no matter what. So now I feel like I should ask the question of this video. Can you be a witch and a Thelamite? Can you do both? Do you have to pick? You can do both. You can absolutely do both, because Thelema has a meaning. I'm not trying to say Thelema. This is the thing. Whenever I talk about how you can be a Thelamite and other things, some people do interpret that as like Thelema has no meaning. Thelema is just the sentence, do what thou wilt. And that's not really what I've tried to get at. I've tried to argue that Thelema has different ways it can express, because Thelema is so weaving into so many things, and because Thelema argues that we all have our true will and our own personal true will, that we can all have our own personal path, which I think that's what I'm trying to get at, not that Thelema is meaningless. But yeah, I think you can absolutely be a Thelamite and a witch. There's no contradiction there. In fact, there's a lot of precedent to it. So if you see someone calling themselves like a Thalimic witch, they're actually not wrong. Thelema is not the same as what we would call modern witchcraft, like a type of witchcraft that you see on, say, TikTok or Instagram that's kind of trendy. It's not the same as Thalimic magic, and it's not the same as a lot of the witchcraft in here, because something that we do forget is that witchcraft is very complex, and there's a lot of different sort of schools of thought and ways of approaching it. It's not all the same. It's not all one thing. It's not one singular practice. So there are sort of multiple ways that it presents, but you can absolutely be a Thelamite and a witch. These traditions all overlap pretty cleanly. In my opinion, as long as a tradition, this is the thing about overlapping practices or, you know, being eclectic, I think that you can pretty much do it so long as your theology and worldview makes sense together. Like, there are things that just don't make sense, right? Like, I don't know why you would be a Thelamite and then say, I don't know, be some ruthless totalitarian or something. Like, that doesn't make sense, because Thelema has this idea of liberty and will to it. But in general, as long as they make sense together and they don't contradict, I feel like you can mix things together. And I think this is one of the easiest answers, because there's historic precedent to it. People have been doing it for a long time. I mean, unless you want to like call Jack Parsons a fake Thelamite, which, I mean, I guess you can do. If you want to do that, you can. But there's a lot of history to this. And so Thelema is not bound to one specific thing. Thelema is versatile, and it ebbs and flows, and it is the thing that I want to really point out, the foundation of modern Western occultism. You cannot divorce Crowley from what the occult is today. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, you know, put them below. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you ring the bell and do all those things. 93 days later, your holy guardian angel will come and you'll never have to hear the word Typhonian Thelema again. But thank you for watching. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon. I give extra videos every month, ritual guides. You can ask me questions. I have a Discord server, and if you're high enough tier, you can sort of meet with me and, you know, let's talk about your theological path. There's a lot of stuff that I offer on there, so check it out. I also have a Ko-Fi for direct donations if you don't want to subscribe to something. That also takes no fees, so that all that money goes directly to me, whereas most places you can donate to creators, you know, takes a fee. As well, I'm on other platforms. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitch. I stream twice a week. I host the podcast Magnolias and Magic, which is a commentary podcast. Most places podcasts can be found. We're not on Apple Podcasts because we've had some issues with Apple Podcasts, so we're everywhere but there pretty much. I'm also on Telegram. I'm pretty much everywhere. I don't know where I'm not. Like, I guess I'm not on, I don't have like a public Facebook page or something. Like, other than that, like, I don't really know where I'm not. I'm pretty much on every platform you can find me places. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are.